Thank you for that, the other completely unprompted, very natural applause. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about virtue epistemology, which most of you probably never heard of, but actually I think is a very, very relevant way of thinking about stuff for skeptics and people who are interested in critical thinking and science. And in fact, there will be at least 2 more panels today. I think it's going to be relevant throughout the conference, but what you're about to hear now. But particularly to 2 more panels, one this afternoon on values in science, and another one tomorrow morning early on conceptual penises. Not coincidentally, I'm going to be on both panels, actually. So that's going to be fun. All right, so shouldn't skeptics know what they're talking about when they're talking about it? I would think so, but let me be more clear about what that means. So let me start broadly. I know this is an audience of skeptics. You should know what skepticism is about, but let me just remind you, or at least let me give you my version of what skepticism is about, right? Typically, skepticism is associated with this very, very famous phrase by Carl Sagan, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That phrase actually traces back a few centuries, 2.5 centuries ago, to David Hume, who was a very influential philosopher and said something along the similar lines: a wise man proportions his beliefs to the evidence. And that goes also for women, transgenders, and anybody else. A wise person proportions his beliefs or her beliefs or their beliefs to the evidence. In fact, Hume's version is broader really than Sagan's, right? Sagan was thinking, of course, about extraordinary claims, UFOs, parapsychology, things like that. Hume is thinking about any claim. In general, we should proportion our beliefs to the evidence, which implies that beliefs come in degrees, right? You can believe something from at 0 to 100%, and that percentage ought to be proportional and ought to change over time with whatever it is. Let me start my timer. Okay, now I've got an extra couple of minutes, according to my watch. I don't think it works that way. All right, now, what do we apply these maxims to? I think to 2 broad categories. I'm going to give you like a 30-second version of the history of the Stoic movement. No, that got nothing to do with Stoicism. Skeptic movement. So typically, and by typically I mean from the 1960s, 70s, 80s, most of the 90s the skeptics have been dealing with that sort of stuff, right? So UFOs, astrology, telepathy, weird people-looking things that walk into the snow, that sort of stuff, right? But then, in the last few years, as I'm sure you are aware of, particularly at places like NECSS, we have expanded our purview. We've actually talked about other things. We don't talk a lot about these because by now we're pretty convinced that there are no flying saucers visiting Earth and that astrology is bunk. So we've actually moved into things that actually are much more questionable, much more difficult to deal with, and in fact even much more socially relevant. Things like anti-vaccination stuff, homeopathy over there, global warming, and then one down there is creationist. That's Jesus on top of a dinosaur, as you can see there. Why? Because these things have to do with public health. They have to do with the health of the environment. They have to do with public education, things like that. So they're actually relevant, and they are the kinds of things that skeptics really can help. However, they can help. Well, I'll tell you in a minute how they can help. We can help. So these 2 categories, keep these 2 categories in mind. There are also some other categories where some skeptics, at least, have moved, and those are actually territories that are a little bit more fraught with danger. In particular, professional philosophy and professional science. That one is a picture somehow representing string theory over there. So some skeptics have gone into this business of, oh, well, is string theory science or pseudoscience or things like that. Others, as you'll hear tomorrow, have gone into conceptual penises, determine whether some philosophy is pseudo-philosophy or not, and that sort of stuff. Okay? Now, what is the difference between these categories? I think that category 1, group 1, is where skeptics have a unique expertise beyond even that of scientists. Right? So you heard James Randi last night. This is what skeptics classically do. UFOs, bending spoons and things like that. Why? Because actually we have accumulated a unique type of expertise. There are investigators like Randy, like Joe Nickell for CSI and so on and so forth, who actually have specialized for many, many years. They know that stuff better than any scientist. If you talk to a physicist or a biologist or psychologists say, can you actually show why Uri Geller is a buffoon? I have no idea, right? Because they don't have the specific expertise. In group 2, we can still do a lot, even though we don't actually have specific technical expertise. Most of us, I mean, there are exceptions, of course, but most of us are not biology, evolutionary biologists. We're not medical doctors. We're not medical researchers, especially. We're not neuroscientists, right? But we can do something about group 2 in the previous slides because we rely on scientific expertise and act as mediators to the public. Okay, so our role there is a kind of a grassroots critical thinking movement, try to mediate between scientists who often don't actually talk to the public in general. You know, there are some exceptions, but most of the time they don't. They got other things. They had to do science. And the rest of the public that is woefully ignorant of science, unfortunately. Science literacy in this country is among the lowest in Western countries in general, right? So that's also useful. Group 3, however, is problematic. So those are when we get into things like technical philosophy or technical science, because actually we don't have sufficient expertise even as mediators. Most of us just don't understand things like string theory, quantum mechanics, or things like that. Well, we've heard of it. It's like, quantum mechanics. But if you do that, you sort of look more like Deepak Chopra than like a skeptic, right? If you just hand wave. And so I actually would suggest that those things need to be taken much, much more carefully when skeptics actually make pronouncements about technical fields of expertise that they do not have expertise in. Once again, I'm gonna say the word once again because I like it, conceptual penis, then we run into trouble. Okay, so this is sort of my view of what skepticism is about and perhaps shouldn't be about. Now let me introduce you to virtue epistemology. So epistemology, of course, is the study of how we know things. It's a branch of philosophy, and it's closely related to logic, right? And so you learn about it in logic classes, in philosophy classes, and so on and so forth. And then there is applied epistemology that has to do, of course, with how science works, scientific methodology, that sort of stuff. Virtue epistemology, however, is a very different, somewhat novel approach to epistemology. The standard epistemology takes the point of view that human knowledge is to be understood as from a point of view from nowhere, from a God's eye view, as if, in fact, we had access to, and I'll show you a slide about this in a minute, as if we had objective access to the world as it is. Virtue epistemology, on the other hand, shifts things around, as I'll explain in a minute. It is derived from virtue ethics, and that one goes back to Aristotle. Virtue ethics is the idea that you don't do ethics in terms of universal laws, commandments or categorical imperatives or things like that. What you do is you focus on your own behavior. It's about the individual. So what am I supposed to do to be an ethical person? The same goes for virtue epistemology. You don't focus on these, view from nowhere. You focus on yourself. You say, what am I supposed to do in order to actually know what I'm talking about when I do talk about it? Right. So what matters are not just the properties of beliefs. I mean, we do want to have our beliefs as right as possible or as proportional to the evidence as possible, as Hume would say. But the focus here is also on the people holding such beliefs. That is on the character traits from an epistemological perspective of the people. In this case, I mean us here, not other people. You're not supposed to. This is not the idea here is not to take virtue epistemology and go around clubbing other people. Yeah, you're not virtually epistemological. No, it's or something like that wouldn't work anyway. No, it's about us. It's about getting up in front of the mirror and say, "Am I doing the right thing here? What am I doing?" Right, so it directs the attention to the knower as an agent responsible for her beliefs. That's the idea. As skeptics, we're supposed to be knowers, or the best that there is to know that human knowledge is capable of, and so the focus is on us. Now, why move from sort of standard epistemology to virtue epistemology, and why is it that this matters to skeptics in particular? Because science, as I said a minute ago, does not actually have a God's eye view of the world. Scientists often pretend that is the case. If you read scientific, how many people here have ever read a scientific paper, technical scientific paper? Good, excellent. So you know that they're incredibly boring. I mean, I've written 150-something of them, so I know. They're incredibly boring, right? So they're always written in the third person, and then the most, sort of impersonal way possible, sort of we did blah, 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 even though it's me writing. It's like, I did. No, we did or they did. And they are supposed to convey this idea of sort of impartiality, objectivity. It's nothing about the agent. I don't have any opinions here. It's just the truth as it is. But of course, that's not the real world. Science doesn't work that way. The real world looks more like that. So truth is that geometrical figure in the middle, right? That cylinder right there. And as you can see, that cylinder projects very different kinds of partial truths on those two screens, depending on how you look at it. This, I hasten to say, is not a license for epistemic relativism. I'm not telling you that anything goes, that any view is just as good as any other. You can see from that same picture that lots of views are not good. If you were to tell me that one of those projections is a triangle instead of a circle or a square, I will say, what the hell? There is no triangle there. Objectively, there is no triangle there. But the idea is that we don't have access to the truth like that. We have it like that. And so every truth that we have, every statement that we make, every belief that we hold is actually always irreducibly from a particular point of view. And therefore partial. And therefore it could be wrong. Or at least incomplete. Right? Right. So if you want to be a good virtue epistemologist, what you want to do is to practice the virtues and to avoid the vices. Right? So I'm going to give you a list of virtues and a list of vices. We're going to then apply these to two case studies. The third one, the conceptual penis, is coming tomorrow morning. And then we're going to close with a checklist for the truly virtuous skeptic. All right. So here's the list of virtues and vices. What you do want to do is to be on the left side of that table. Attentiveness, benevolence, you want to practice conscientiousness, creativity, curiosity, discernment, honesty, humility. I'm going to say it again. Humility, objectivity, parsimony, studiousness, understanding, warrant, wisdom. I know you don't see the lower ones because they're, but trust me. What you want to avoid, on the other hand, are things like close-mindedness, dishonesty, dogmatism, gullibility, naivete, obtuseness, self-deception, superficiality, and visual thinking. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, of course I'm on the left. And of course Deepak Chopra is on the right. I'll show you two cases where that is not, in fact, the case. Okay? The first one has to do with astrology. Okay. And it brings up a couple of interesting characters, 2 or 3 interesting characters. You probably know, in fact, you certainly know 2 of them. You might not know this guy. Paul Feyerabend was the bad boy of philosophy of science. He wrote a book called Against Method, where he very surprisingly and very shockingly, back in the 60s, suggested that contrary to what most philosophers at the time, and certainly every scientist at the time would tell you, there is no such thing as a scientific method. That science is just whatever works. It's a very pragmatic thing. If something works, you use it. If it doesn't work, you don't use it. You keep changing that stuff. There is no rhyme or reason to it. Funny thing is, most philosophers of science at this point actually tend to agree with Feyerabend. They wouldn't put it quite as starkly as he did. But in fact, more and more studies in the history and philosophy of science show that scientists themselves do change their methodology. They do change their approaches. Again, that doesn't mean anything goes. There's all sorts of stuff that doesn't go, but what does go changes with the circumstances, and it's updated constantly. Now, Feyerabend, back in 1975, wrote this very controversial paper called In Defense of Astrology. Now, hold on. Hold it. It was very clear that, no, I don't believe in astrology. He didn't believe in astrology. But he had a problem with something else, in fact, with someone else in particular, and that someone else was Paul Kurtz. The grandfather, I would say, of modern skepticism. So Kurtz, who died a few years ago, he was, I hope you people know who he was, but he was the founder of, Skeptical Inquiry magazine and Free Inquiry and the CFI and a bunch of stuff. In fact, almost everything you can think of until recently, except for NECSS and a couple of other things, Paul had something to do with it. Now, back in 75, Paul got 186 scientists to sign a manifesto against astrology. Right? He was worried about New Age thinking. Remember, so mid-70s, so this is right at the, after the late 60s and early 70s. And lots of people were going around saying all sorts of stupid things about how the world works. And he was getting worried, so he got together 186 colleagues and wrote a manifesto. Here's some excerpts from this manifesto. It said, in part, we, the undersigned astronomers, astrophysicists, and scientists in other fields, wish to caution the public against the unquestioning acceptance of the predictions and advice given privately and publicly by astrologers. In ancient times, people believed in the predictions and advice of astrologers because astrology was part and parcel of their magical worldview. Why do people believe in astrology? In these uncertain times, many long for the comfort of having guidance in making decisions, etc., 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 right? And I'm sure you agree with most of these these are a bunch of talking points, right? All right. Problem is, Feyerabend said, yeah, all of this is fine, but the majority of 186 signatories to that manifesto actually demonstrably don't understand astrology. They have not done their due diligence. They have actually not done their work. They literally don't know what they're talking about. They just went on board because, like, yeah, of course I'm against astrology. What do I sign? And therefore, Feyerabend didn't use the term because the virtue epistemology didn't exist, but they were not epistemologically virtuous. He wasn't the only one, interestingly, to think so. Because if I know that these audience, I don't know about these audience, I want to make assumptions, but in past years, we've had some interesting discussions whenever I bring up philosophy. Philosophers, they don't do anything. My friend Neil deGrasse Tyson, for instance, thinks that philosophy is a waste of time. And I told him several times, what the hell, Neil? What is your problem? So I know that if I bring just a philosophy, that's a philosopher talking. But what about Carl Sagan? He's one of our role models. He's one of the people, the founding members of the movement. In fact, together with Paul Kurtz, he established the Skeptical Inquiry magazine and a number of other early organizations. Sagan did not sign up for that manifesto. And he wrote down his objections. And here's some of his objections. He said, I struggled with the manifesto's wording, and in the end found myself unable to sign. Not because I thought astrology has any validity whatever, that's the same as Feyerabend, but because I felt that the tone of the statement was authoritarian. It criticized astrology for having origins shrouded in superstition. But this is true as well for religion, chemistry, medicine, and astronomy, to mention only 4. The issue is not what faltering and rudimentary knowledge astrology came from, but what it is, its present validity. This is an important point. Right? If you use that as an argument against astrology, somebody immediately can come back, if they know anything about the history of science, and say, but wait a minute, astronomy also started out the same way, and so did chemistry, and so on and so forth. So what does that mean? Does the logical inference therefore follow that also astronomy and chemistry are not good? No, it doesn't. Well, then it doesn't for astrology either. It must be that you disagree with astrologers for some other reason, not because initially it was shrouded in superstition. Then there was speculation this is still Sagan, on the psychological motivations of those who believed in astrology. These motivations might explain why astrology is not generally given the skeptical scrutiny it deserves, but it is quite peripheral to whether it works. It doesn't matter why something is popular or why some people believe some things. The question is, does it work or does it not? Right? And just because people believe or don't believe certain things, I mean, lots of people don't believe in evolution, and yet evolution is, current science. Most people believe in homeopathy, and yet homeopathy don't work. So people's beliefs have nothing to do, or very little to do, with whether some notion is or is not sound. The statement stressed that we can think of no mechanism by which astrology could work. This is certainly a relevant point, but by itself is unconvincing. No mechanism was known for continental drift, for example, when it was proposed by Alfred Wegener in the first quarter of the 20th century to explain a range of puzzling data in geology and paleontology. So even not having a mechanism, which is a standard skeptic response to things like astrology and so on and so forth, well, yeah, we don't have a mechanism because we might not actually have discovered yet. Plenty of times in the history of science, people have come up with discoveries, things that work, and then we figure out why they worked, on what basis they worked. So I found it interesting that Sagan, together with Feyerabend, even though they didn't know each other, was objecting on what I consider virtue epistemological grounds to the statement. It's not that he was saying astrology works. It just was saying, look, you got to come up, if you want to go public and make a statement signed by 186 people, etc., you better get your reasoning right and your facts straight. Otherwise, you're actually undermining the credibility, not only your own credibility, but the credibility of the entire skeptic movement, critical thinking, and so on and so forth. Let me give you a second example. So this happened in 2004. On 5 March 2004, a reconnaissance aircraft of the Mexican government was flying over a couple of Mexican states looking for evidence of drug smuggling. That nothing has changed since 2004. And the crew videotaped the appearance of up to 11 unidentified objects that seemed to be visible only in the infrared. This was a big deal, because this was a military aircraft. There were lots of people. There was a video going on that was clearly authenticated by the Mexican government. So this is, UFO aficionados immediately said, ha ha, we told you so, right? Now, what happened next was that a good number of local skeptics rushed to explain what the Campeche UFOs were all about. And here's some of the explanations. According to José de la Herrín, who was a local astronomer, these were meteor fragments. According to Julio Herrera of Mexico's National Autonomous University, these were electrical flares in the atmosphere. According to Rafael Navarro of the National Autonomous University, these were sparks of plasma energy. According to the Urania Astronomical Society of Morelos, this was a group of weather balloons. Do you see anything common among all of these explanations? No facts to back them up. That's right. They're just made up. This is armchair skepticism. Okay? They knew that the UFOs couldn't possibly be real, so there had to be a rational explanation for it, and they grabbed for the first when they came about. The other thing that all these explanations show is, first of all, they're all mutually exclusive. Right? It can't be all of them. At most, it can be one. And in fact, they're all wrong. The reality is that the Campeche UFOs were stationary objects on the ground on the horizon. They were actually flares erupting from oil wells. And that's why they were emitting in the infrared. It was the very high temperature of these things, right? That's not an actual picture of the UFOs. I couldn't find one, but that's what flares look like. And so you can imagine that if you're flying at high elevation, there was fog and all that sort of stuff, and you just see these lights that are not stationary, because, the flares themselves are stationary, the oil wells are stationary, but the flames themselves are kind of move a little bit, look like they're moving around. So it was an honest mistake. The point is, the mistake was honest. The interpretations were not, right? And that is a major failure of virtue epistemology. You don't make up stuff, because otherwise you end up just as bad as the other side, right? Okay, so what's the big deal here? Well, the problem is, I think, that skepticism shares its core values with science, and these values include honesty, epistemic humility, and all the other virtues that I show you. Science itself does have values. We'll have this panel discussion about science and values this afternoon. Science, there are such things as scientific values. It's not a value-free enterprise. Now, we think normally of values as things that regulate our day-to-day interaction with other people. But that's only one set of values. The other set of values has to do with epistemic stuff. It has to do with being honest, with being open-minded, and so on and so forth. So what is supposed to separate us from the creationists, or from whatever other purveyor of pseudoscience, climate change deniers and so on and so forth, is not that we happen to be right or mostly right. We hope that we're going to be right. We think we're right, but so do they. Most pseudoscientists or proponents of pseudoscience, that nobody wants to be called a pseudoscientist, but that sounds weird, like, oh, I'm a pseudoscientist and I play one on TV. But most supporters of what we call pseudoscience are not frauds. Some of them are, for sure. Ask James Randi. Right? Lots of them, some of them are. But lots of them are not. Have you ever been to a UFO conference, for instance? How many people here have been to a UFO conference? Yeah. Go. Have a look. It looks like a Star Trek thing, except that they, except that they actually believe that the Enterprise is real, and so on and so forth, right? These are genuine people. These are people who want to believe in the right thing. They want to actually know that things are right, the things that they believe. So in that sense, they're just like us. So the difference here is, of course, that we think we're right, but so do they. But the major difference is that we actually seek the truth, whatever it may be, even if it goes against our beliefs, even if it goes against our expectations. They tend to rationalize the information that they get, the data that they get, in order to fit with the preconceived notion. That is something that we ought absolutely not to do. That means that we need to do the hard work of actually doing the research. We don't sit in an armchair and pontificate. I hear a lot of making fun of philosophers because philosophers are it's armchair speculation. Yeah, except that in philosophy, that's legitimate. That's what we do. Right? It's like saying, oh, you're an armchair mathematician. Yeah, of course, no kidding. Right? But an armchair skeptic, no, there's no such thing as an armchair skeptic. Okay, so here's the promised checklist for the virtuous skeptic. All of this, by the way, you can download from my website, which is platofootnote.org. It's both a blog and a website, and all the slides are there. So, did I carefully consider my opponent's arguments without dismissing them out of hand? Did I interpret what my opponent said in the most charitable way possible before mounting a response? In other words, I didn't make a caricature of what they said. Did I seriously entertain the possibility that I may be wrong? Or am I too blinded by my own preconceptions? Am I an expert on this matter? If not, did I consult an expert? Or did I just conjure my own unfounded opinion? Like Googling it. Did I check the reliability of my own sources, or I just Google whatever was convenient to throw at my opponent? I can't tell you now how many times and how annoying it is on Facebook and on Twitter when we get into these link wars. Oh, here's my opinion. Link to a book. I'm sorry. Do you want me to read a book before actually responding to you? And then, of course, you're going to, all you're going to do, I know, all you're going to do is as soon as my first sentence is written down, you're going to send me another link to another book or another article. And, two can play that game. Right? I mean, you Google climate science skepticism, and certain things come out. Climate science denialism, and other things come out. And then all we're doing is to exchange Google searches with each other. Right? Nobody understands a damn thing about this stuff. You can't read that one probably, but after having done my research, do I actually know what I'm talking about, or am I simply repeating somebody else's opinion? Right? In philosophy, the standard definition of knowledge comes all the way back from Plato. So it's been around for like 2,400 years. And it is that knowledge is justified true belief. Justified true belief. It means that if you think you know something, that implies that you believe it. That would be kind of weird to say, I know that the earth goes around the sun, but I don't believe it. It's like, what, right? But the two important things are justified and true. So we want to make sure that it is true or as close to the truth that is possible. Okay? Whenever I use that example, some smart aleck says, actually that's not true. It's the sun and the earth that rotate around a common center. Yeah, whatever, I know that. But as a first approximation, that's pretty good. It's the earth that goes around the sun and not the other way around, so it's true. Now, what about justification? Can I actually give you an explanation of how I know that the earth goes around the sun? I can, actually, as it turns out. But most of the times, we say stuff that we simply believe because we've heard somebody else saying it. Do you know, I'm sure most people here believe in quantum mechanics, whatever that means. But can you actually give me an explanation for why quantum mechanics is the most fundamental theory in science? I can't. If you tell me, why are you believing in quantum mechanics? Well, because I got physicist friends who tell me that it's right. Okay? That's all I can do. I can trust some people. I can trust some experts. But if you ask me, why do you believe that? Do you have a justification? No, not really. Okay? And we have to admit that. It's fine. There is no shame in not knowing things. There is shame in pretending that we know things that we actually don't know. That's the bottom line. That's pretty much all I wanted to say. I'm going to leave you with a quote from Aristotle. Humility requires us to honor truth above our friends. Thank you very much. Now, according to my watch and to what they're telling me on the side, we do have a little bit of time for Q&A. So any opinions, any justified true opinions or anything like that?
Sure.
Anything, any question? Yes, back there. Or back, yeah, why don't you take it? Yes. Mm-hmm.
I have a philosophy question.
Okay.
Could you please compare virtue epistemology to radical empiricism?
Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, it's going to take us the rest of the morning to do that. No. So radical empiricism is actually a fringe position within philosophy. It used to be a dominant position back actually when David Hume and other, David Hume was an empiricist, not quite a radical empiricist, but there were more or less radical empiricists at the time. John Locke was one of them, for instance. So a radical empiricist is somebody that tells you that all human knowledge, everything, comes out of sense data, of things that you can see, smell, hear, and so on and so forth. There's no a priori knowledge. There's no stuff that you know before the experience. Ultimately, all the source of our knowledge is empirical. And a lot of scientists, if you ask them that kind of question and you tell them what radical empiricism is, they will probably say, yeah, that sounds right. But it isn't. It is not because demonstrably there are things that actually we arrive at, knowledge of, that we arrive at without empirical evidence. Lots of theoretical mathematics, for instance. Logic counts as knowledge, as far as I can tell. And in fact, both mathematics and logic have applications to real-world situations. But they don't come out of empirical evidence. And so radical empiricism is this, I think, indefensible position at this point where all our knowledge, it has been indefensible since Immanuel Kant. So up to Kant, in philosophy, there were two major trajectories. One was the empiricist, the other one was the rationalist, who on the other hand thought exactly the opposite, that all real knowledge eventually comes out from the fact that we think about stuff. They were impressed by logic and mathematics. They were not crazy. Kant said, no, actually, it's a combination of both. And in fact, there is a third component of knowledge. There is stuff that we know innately. That we are born with certain knowledge about the world. And actually, modern psychology backs up that notion. So human infants seem to have a basic grasp of certain aspects of physics, for instance, or certain aspects of psychology, and so on and so forth. That is, they react in a certain way as if they knew that things that go off the table have to fall down, things like that, right? So that's innate knowledge. Now, you asked about the comparison between that one and sort of virtue epistemology. Virtue epistemology basically simply tells you it doesn't take sides in terms of empiricism versus rationalism. It simply tells you wherever you think your knowledge comes from, you just have to do your due diligence. You have to look at yourself in the mirror and say, on what basis do I believe whatever it is that I believe?
In cases like the UFO, the suspected UFO in Mexico, pseudoscience spreads quickly. Real research takes time. What can the media and experts do in between the research and the pseudoscience to kind of stem the flow of the irrational explanation?
That's an excellent question. And, there's no good answer to it. I mean, the honest answer there is like, I don't know. Let me see. I'll get back to you next week. Of course, by the time you get back to them, they've forgotten about it, and now you got a UFO into the media kind of thing. Yes, but then you have to ask yourself, again, what is the least worst situation here? Am I going to make up stuff just because I want to stem the tide of pseudoscience at the risk of being dishonest with myself, first of all, and second of all, at the risk of undermining the credibility of science or skepticism? Or am I just going to try to educate people about the fact that, look, sometimes we just don't know stuff, and sometimes, as you said, it takes time to know stuff. So give me time, and if you don't want to give me time, then believe in whatever fantasy or whatever immediate explanation you want, but you don't have warrant for belief. After all, one of the nice things about UFOs is that it literally means unidentified flying object, right? So you could say, was this a UFO? Yes, it was. Was it a flying saucer? Probably not, but I'll get back to you. We got 5 more minutes, yeah. Go ahead.
Where do you see philosophy going in the near future? And do you have any strong opinions about public philosophers like Sam Harris or Chandler Summers?
Ooh. Please don't put the word public philosophy and Sam Harris in the same sentence, unless there is a not between. All right, so that's also another really complicated question, but thanks for asking it. What do I see philosophy? Well, philosophy as a technical field is going in the same directions as other technical academic fields, including biology, physics, literary criticism, history, whatever it is. That is going to be more and more specialized, more and more technical, more and more focused on tiny little things, because that's just the nature of academic discourse at this point. I don't think it's a good thing necessarily, but it looks like that's been going that way for the last half a century, and it will keep going like that. But it's not exclusive to philosophy. It's pretty much every academic field is getting hyper-specialized. In fact, we're getting into a problem where lots of people know a lot about nothing, and then there's very few people who actually step back and sort of take a broader look and put things in context. In terms of public philosophy, I think it's an excellent thing, just like public science is an excellent thing, and it's actually finally getting off the ground. So scientists themselves took some time to get to finally start talking to the public. Carl Sagan ran into trouble because he was too much, according to his colleagues, of a science popularizer. He famously did not get into the National Academy of Science because people thought that it's not too fluffy. This guy does television. As it turns out, he wasn't too fluffy at all. The number of scientific technical papers that he published and technical books was just about in the average of what members of the National Academy. So that's a pretty high standard. But he didn't get in. A few years later, biologist Stephen Jay Gould, who is one of the most famous popularizers in the late part of the 20th century, actually did get into the National Academy. So scientists in the last 20 years or so have definitely changed their tune in that respect. There is still some criticism of scientists by their colleagues if they do too much popularizing. But if you ever gone to the World Science Festival, which is basically the New York Science Festival, but since New York is the world, it's the same thing. Those are all prominent scientists who go there and talk, and it's filled. The audiences are very large, and it's very nice events. Philosophy is going in the same. Public philosophy is going in the same direction. It used to be like until a few years ago. If you went to the philosophy section of the bookstores, there are things like bookstores still, right? Yeah. What you would see is a bunch of New Age titles. And then, the History of Western Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. And that was about it. Now you find lots of books like the one that was mentioned that I just published, for instance, for the public. There is more public understanding of philosophy. I think that is unqualified good. More public understanding of any academic discipline, not just philosophy or science, but also history or psychology or whatever it is. I think it's a good thing. So I think in academics, not only should be encouraged to do it, but they actually ought to do it as a way to give back to the public and to engage the public and try to make this a better society, a better informed society. We probably have time for one, maybe two more. Yeah, on this side, there was somebody else, but yes, over there.
A little off the subject. How is it?
Yes, PlatoFootnote.org.
How is it being a Stoic? How's it going?
Sorry, say that again because I was answering her.
How's it going being a Stoic?
Pretty well. pretty good. I've been practicing Stoicism, modern version of Stoicism, which is not a philosophy of going through life with a stiff upper lip and suppressing emotion. If you want to know what it is about, buy my book or check my website. It's cheaper. Not that one. The other one. There is one called howtobeastoic.org. It's going well. I've been practicing for 3 years. It seems like things have improved in a number of ways. I seem to be dealing with problems better. I don't get upset by Sam Harris as much as I used to. So it's all good. One more and then we're done. Yeah, over there. Do we have a microphone somewhere? Thank you.
Thought we were done. Do you think that it's appropriate to speculate about, for something like a UFO sighting, to speculate about more mundane explanations so long as it is couched as such? For example, for an astronomer to say this appears consistent with meteors?
It's okay, but it is a dangerous kind of thing to do because those people, according to themselves, to their understanding, they were actually speculating in what they thought was an informed way, and look what happened. None of them got it right. So I think that's why that's a good cautionary tale. It's not just about the fact that people made up explanations. It turns out that nobody got it right. right? So, which means, of course, that their speculations were not particularly well informed. But these were people who ought to have been in a position to speculate reasonably, right? Because these were all astronomers, and they were all, people that actually knew something about night stuff. So no, I would say don't do that unless it's very clear to you that that's a very good possibility. And if you do, always couch it very carefully, as you just did, in terms of, look, I don't know. So those are magic words that we just don't use enough, especially with the public. I don't know, but. Right? All right, thanks very much, guys.